I called to order the special meeting here on July 24th, 2025 of the Zoning Code Update Citizen Advisory Committee of the Town of Clarkdale. Could we have the roll call, please?
Member Powell. Here. Member Selna. Member Smith.
Present.
Member Jones. Present. Member Conk.
Here.
Member Backus. Member Fruit.
Here.
Member Steiner.
Here.
Vice Chair Becky Beck.
Here.
Chair Allison.
Here. Okay, do we have any public comment tonight, this afternoon? Okay, nobody online? Okay, so seeing none, let's go to item 4, discussion, the 2 items on the agenda.
Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here tonight, this evening. My name is Martina Keel. I'm contracted with the town to prepare the housing plan. So we thought it would be a good idea to have you guys get in the loop in terms of the progress we've been making. We do have a working group of employers and other stakeholders that have been meeting. They were invited this evening as well. So far not here, but perhaps they'll have an opportunity to join us. Oh, Robin, my apologies. You are here. So Robin knows kind of what's going on with that. She gets to be on both committees. So I am here this evening to go through the first part of the housing plan, which is the housing needs assessment. And before I do that, I'm going to give you a little overview of kind of what's required and what the process will be. And then I really want to hear from you, like what your thoughts are. So I will do that kind of the brief overview, tell you a little bit about the progress we've been making on community outreach so far. And then I will be asking you to share your thoughts and your ideas about where we go in terms of action planning. Next slide, please. Or can I use this? I can try. I'm assuming. Yeah, I don't think so. It doesn't want to go on.
There we go.
Is it working? Okay, they're not talking, so we'll just do next slide. We'll try again shortly. All right, so you can see the lovely artwork. I don't know how many of you went and judged the poster contest at the school, but this is part of our outreach and education campaign. This was our winner of the poster contest. And it will be this, you'll see this image on the cover of the plan, as well as hopefully on posters in local businesses, just kind of raising awareness. And kids art, at least for me, always kind of gives me a smile. So it was a pleasure to do this. So in terms of the required elements of the housing plan, this plan is actually funded from a grant from the Arizona Department of Housing. So they have several requirements as part of accepting that grant. One is this housing needs assessment. And the other piece of it is the community education and outreach. And then, of course, an action plan that addresses kind of what are the barriers that we're facing and what initiatives might we put in place to address those barriers. And there's also a requirement that the governing body adopt a resolution that they will implement the plan. So yeah, I know, grimace, grimace. So in addition to that, Clarkdale elected to do the zoning code update. So when Ruth and I looked at the grant, I'm like, how much do you need to do the zoning code update? Because obviously that's a key piece of being able to implement solid actions. So I'm grateful to all of you for, giving this your time and your attention. Try one more time. Nope. Okay. So this is the schedule. Here we are today with the housing needs assessment. There'll be preliminary strategic initiatives being developed over the next couple of months. Those will be kind of concurrent with some community outreach that's going to be done at some of the events down here. And so residents can kind of try and grasp some of the things that we're talking about and get to have their say, maybe dots, but we'll certainly have pictures and boards so they can do some thinking about what's important to them. September through November, then we'll be finalizing the strategic objectives. I'll be meeting with the working group that I mentioned earlier. And we'll be doing some additional resident input as we kind of narrow down the potential initiatives. And also concurrent with that is your continuing efforts with the zoning code update. And so there'll be council work sessions, public hearings, all the fun stuff that you get to do as part of the code update. And then we'll have a draft action plan ready in January that will incorporate the changes to the zoning code, other recommendations, looking long-term out to 2035. So it is a 10-year look at what we might be able to accomplish. March, April, and we're shooting for council adoption. And then it is beyond that implementation time. So that's the schedule and kind of the elements that are left. And you're welcome to interrupt me at any point in time. So if you have questions. So here's the second place poster contest winner. So as you know, this was part of the community education and outreach. We have the working group. We also did an employee and employer survey. And I'll talk a little bit about those. And then the resident input that we'll be doing in the coming month. And then again, a little bit later in the year into early next year. So the workforce survey, 64 responses, which considering, how big Clarkdale is, I was actually pretty pleased with the response. 60% of the respondents actually reside in Clarkdale, and 55% of them are homeowners. Several of them are actually looking for move-up options. Interesting to me was that there were 4 respondents who are living in RVs, and they all said, there's nothing real, or actually half of them said, you know what, there's no place affordable for me to park my RV close to work. So in the survey, I asked not just about housing, but I asked about like what has impacts on your household and your ability to meaningfully participate in the local economy. Wages came out on top of housing. And housing was closely followed by healthcare, debt burden, and then healthy food access. So it was, it was kind of interesting to me that wages came out on the top, considering it was a housing survey. Not surprising, but just interesting. Of the respondents, we asked them if they were looking to purchase a new home, purchase a different home, or rent in Clarkdale. So 21 of them said, yep, looking to move up or buy a unit. Half of them considered $250,000 to be an affordable purchase price. So, thinking way back in history to when housing cost $250,000, right? But it's still reality for our workforce. They made that loud and clear. Good news, 57% saving for a down payment. And as expected, people want garages and fenced yards. It's just part of life, right? 7 were looking to rent. Most do not have savings to go into a new unit. And I estimate the cost of going into a new unit to be $4,000. So that's just right up front. So that's it's a lot of saving for somebody who says, I can only afford $700 a month in rent to begin with. So you can see kind of it was a range of 700, kind of in that 9 to 1100 a month range. And then one that said, oh, I can go, above 1250. So the housing needs assessment has three primary components. The first one is the recent drivers of housing demand. So that's an analysis of kind of what got us here over the last 5 to 6 years, maybe a little longer than that. Kind of what's the current housing need, including the need among workforce households. And then there's a third piece of it that looks forward and projects households going into 2035. I'm not going to focus on that piece today because I really want to hear from you. So I want to clarify when I talk about housing need and demand are housing need and housing demand are not the same thing. Developers, builders, our construction industry, our building industry is geared to address demand. So they say who's moving here or who lives here, what do they want in housing, what can they afford in housing, and they bring it to the market, right? And your part of your job is to hopefully make that a little easier for them in general. Need, on the other hand, is just a component of demand that says, you know what? Yeah, I need housing, right? I just like everybody else, I'm part of that demand. However, I can't afford the housing that's in the market. So the private sector has absolutely zero incentive to lose money and build affordable housing or housing that's affordable to the people who need it in the community. And that's why we have these conversations about what interventions or initiatives can we implement to maybe make it possible for people to be sustainably housed. So recent demand. This is not going to probably be any surprise to you, but my analysis says 98% of the demand for housing between 2017 and 2022, 2023, which is when we have data for, is all in migration. So most of the growth here is people moving in, it's not young families adding to the population, going out on their own. It's people who are moving here. The people who are moving here have a household income that is about $21,000 higher than the people who are leaving here. So what we're seeing is kind of an in-migration of higher income households, and guess what? They can afford higher cost housing. And so we see median income kind of going up and we say, oh, good, the incomes are going up. And it's really a result of the people who are moving in, not necessarily, remarkable increases in wages or any of those kinds of things. So that's an important kind of thing to keep in the back of our mind, is that, the development community is developing for the people who are moving here. So another thing that I found really interesting was when I looked back through, this is assessor data. When I looked back through the assessor's data, a third of the homes in Clarkdale transferred ownership between 2020 and 2024. So that's the kind of churn. You all are nodding your head. You probably have lived here for a while. You've got lots and lots of new neighbors. 1/3 of homes. 1/3. Yep. So it's more than in any prior decade. So I looked at it, 2020 to 2024. What about the decades kind of prior to that? After the crash, before the crash, kind of, going back as far as the records did. Of those property transfers, 1 in 5 were second homes and investment properties. So lower than I see in other parts of the state, but still, I think, pretty remarkable. And then also, no surprise, of new construction, single family detached is pretty much all of it. Although I have to say, I went through Centerville today before I came to the meeting, and I saw several new placements in there. It actually looked really good. I was like, well, I was just here 2 months ago doing a survey. So yes.
How do you know whether somebody is buying a primary home or a secondary home?
The assessor has a use code. So there's a, you know, so somebody who doesn't occupy as a primary residence is taxed at a different rate than somebody who does occupy as a primary residence.
Okay. I'm a Realtor and I just don't know how that information is conveyed. That's why I was asking. I'm like, oh, I've
Yeah,
never
I
heard
have-
anybody
yeah.
ask me that before.
Yeah, I have the pleasure of looking at assessor's data
Yeah.
fairly
It's
regularly.
not, it's not on any of the sales paperwork, but it may be recorded somewhere I'm not familiar with.
Well, and I do suspect that not everybody reports that they're not occupying their home as a primary residence. So, you know, kind of the giveaway might be like the address in California and, you know, but I just went with the assessor's use codes because, you know, I don't want to assume anything. Yeah. And then I think the other part of the in-migration that is probably something a lot of us know is that about half of the increase in workforce during that 4-year period was people working from home. So it was indeed, you know, partially people moving here who moved here because the location is attractive to them. And they were able to work from home. And hopefully they still are. So and I think part of this kind of income and wage thing that's really interesting is that households, this is census data, but household income, we look at earners, and households with no earners actually had a higher increase in their income during that period of time than 2-earner households and almost double a 1-earner household. So again, it's not wages that are driving the market. I wish it was, but it's not. So a little bit about households, looking at, again, census data. About 2,500 households in 2023. It probably is 2,500 today would be my guess. A little over half are headed by a person over the age of 65. And most of age 65 plus households are indeed homeowners. Very few renters in that age category. About 40% are in their prime working years at 35 to 64, a little lower of a home ownership rate to be expected. And then just 6.4% are headed by a person under the age of 35. And I didn't even bother with the home ownership rate here because it's about 40%. So I think there wasn't room on the slide. So I think the other interesting piece here is that it's a huge volume of households are single person and married couples or 2-person households. So you have lots of 3-bedroom, 2-bath homes that are occupied by one person or 2 people. I'm guilty of that too, but I think it's a function of aging that, you know, we stay in our homes, especially in the economy that we have. Overall, 3/4 of homes that are occupied are owner occupied. So it's a fairly high home ownership rate. Remember, I made the distinction between demand and need, so I'm going to talk about need. So in 2023, when we look at housing need, we say anybody who's paying more than 30 or 35% of their income for housing is considered housing cost burden, and they have some kind of housing need. There's also housing need can spur from living in overcrowded conditions, and lots of people doubled up, or substandard housing conditions. Those are also needs. But in today's world, the primary need is for more affordability. So it's housing cost burden. I want to point out, and this is in the analysis, that when we talk about 30% of income, you know, if you make $18,000 a year, 30% of income is a lot of money, right? If you make $88,000 a year, 30% of income doesn't feel quite like, you know, it's going to be that big of a burden. So I normally think about housing cost burden being more applicable to lower income households than it is to higher income households. Higher income households though can have life events, and that, that can also cause issues, especially when we have an aging population. So our need is about 190 rental units for low and moderate income households. Most of them are single people or single earner households, and the vast majority of them are between the ages of 35 and 64. I can just say, straight up, one bedroom unit, studio units are really going to be probably the highest demand. Yep. And then when we look at owners, because I think it's important to understand that when an owner is housing cost burdened, they might not maintain their home. They might not be eating. They may not be, heating and cooling properly. There's lots of things that can go wrong. So there's 102 households that are age 65 or over who are owners who are paying too much for housing. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. So I want to talk about the workforce again. I'm going to kind of go back to the workforce. Workforce, low and moderate income are somewhat synonymous where we live. It's kind of becoming a more prevalent, actually, not just in Yavapai County where it's been an issue for quite some time, but it's kind of expanding outwards. So right now, if somebody were to purchase a median priced home, which is roughly in the $450,000 range, they would and wanted to make a 20% down payment in order to avoid the extra, the added mortgage insurance premiums and other financing issues. They'd have to come up with $90,000 in order to get below that 20%. So I do a quick and dirty, and I know you're in the real estate industry, and probably several of you are. So this is just a back of the envelope kind of analysis. But if we were to take a nurse practitioner and somebody who is working the average wage in Yavapai County, in 2024 was a little over $51,000 a year. So we take that nurse practitioner and we partner them with somebody who's earning the average wage, and we say, go forth and buy a house, and they're going to have a gap of about $45,000. So they would need some kind of assistance or to save longer in order for the median price home to be affordable. If we look further down into lower income households, say we take a production worker at $45,000 a year and a cook at $41,000 or $42,000 a year, they're going to have an affordability gap of about $190,000. So what this is saying is, we can help our workforce who is at the higher end of the income spectrum to enter into home ownership if they so desire. It's just going to take a little bit of creativity. Probably not quite as easy when we look at lower income. And then I'm just going to look at one bedroom affordability here because remember I was saying, let's talk about one bedroom units. So the median rent on a one bedroom unit, this is countywide because there's really no good data for Clarkdale, is $1,400, $1,422 a month. And this is the fair market rent by the state's housing authority. So the $4,000 in security rent and utility deposits just to get in. So if we start to look at kind of our essential members of our workforce, a firefighter, everybody thinks, oh, firefighters make big bucks. Not so much. So they're kind of right there at the average. They're kind of right there at the average wage unless they've been in the business for a while. When they look at that one bedroom unit, they're going to come up short by about $150 a month. Not too bad. get kind of farther down into the income levels. Production workers are making about 45 a year. They're going to have about a $300 a month difference. And then, our very essential medical assistants, all the people who make doctors' offices and hospitals and all those facilities run, they're only making $37,000 a year. They're going to be about $500 short. So what this says is that even at or working full time, they probably are going to have a roommate in order to afford whatever housing is available if the rent is not subsidized. Yeah. So the next piece is really talking about what's the action plan, and I've just kind of cobbled together some maybe draft policy areas, and I'm curious to get your input on these. One is homes for a range of families. Because obviously, when we have a kind of imbalance in our population and in our makeup, and I realize, you're part of a regional economy, but still, I think personally, I think it's important to look at, do we offer opportunities for people of all income levels and family types to live in our community, live and work in our community? So there's that homes for a range of families. There's developing and maintaining partnerships. Clarkdale is a small town. We're not going to hire housing staff, right? We've got to have kind of straightforward, relatively simple incentives and initiatives that we can implement with the staff that we have. And we need to create partnerships with the stakeholders and the people who actually can get their boots on the ground and make things happen. So, you got to have somebody who's going to be willing to kind of create those partnerships. Preserving Clarkdale's character and neighborhoods, I think, is vitally important. I've now toured 3 of Clarkdale's neighborhoods. I did Patio Park in late 2023, actually go back down there periodically. And then looked at Centerville not that long ago, did a windshield survey through there, and help me. Hotels, thank you. And so I've been, through all of the kind of non-HOA and older neighborhoods and done housing kind of windshield survey, looking at conditions. But I think that, preserving those neighborhoods that are affordable is going to be really crucial going forward because we can't build subdivisions at a price that's going to be affordable. And then, of course, the raising awareness, the community education piece. So that's kind of what I'm thinking, in terms of big picture, in terms of categories. I want to talk a little bit about the working group that I mentioned and some of the recommendations that they made before I start asking you what you guys think. So right on the front end, they were like, somebody's got to demystify the permit process. People just don't understand, especially homeowners, like people who want to place ADUs, there's like now all new legislation this past session around that. So you're going to have people knocking on the door about that. And then small contractors, because it's the small contractors and the small builders who are most likely going to be building the housing that is going to be affordable to the people who are in need. We've got the Neighbors We Need Education campaign that the working group has been giving their input into, and that's really about looking at the workforce and helping people understand what it takes to live on an average income for the people that they need. We all need in our lives. They recommend prioritizing housing for families, saying that 4 and 5 bedroom units just fly off the shelf as soon as they come up. Financial stability and housing education and counseling, so that credit counseling, like preparing people to be good homeowners, to be good renters, to be good tenants. And then from the workforce perspective, really looking at short-term and employer-provided short-term housing opportunities. Like how do we have kind of a reserve of basically executive type housing that people can live in while they're waiting for a more permanent housing solution. And then on the zoning and building side of things, they said, it'd be really helpful to have like a one-page kind of infographic of what's the difference between build out and whatever changes might be implemented through this code revision. One member wanted a site analysis of their site, which is fine. You got to ask, right? Middle housing, which we've all heard that term kind of tossed around a lot in the last couple of years, which is duplexes through quadplexes. And then interestingly enough, making family childcare in residential development easy to do. So, kind of that's part of that code, right? Like does somebody need a special permit? Do they need what do they have to go through in order to do residential daycare in a traditional neighborhood? So those were their recommendations, kind of going into the process early. So when we talk about that one piece of the puzzle that's about homes for a range of families, it's going to require mixing incomes. It's going to be requiring different kinds of maybe mixing housing types, like having true, planned developments that have different kinds of housing to accommodate a variety of families. And it could possibly mean mixing uses. And there's already every time I come here, I'm like, man, there's like this opportunity staring us right here. And then I think the other piece of that is really looking not just at the low and moderate income workforce rental housing that I mentioned, which is going to need to be in that $780 to $1,400 a month range for to be affordable to the workforce. But I think the homeownership, for really looking at like how can we get our middle income families and our middle income renters in particular into homeownership, because it's the wealth building opportunity. Once you're a homeowner, your attitude, I think, towards where you live changes. You feel more permanent, right? You don't feel like you can be upended at any moment. So I think that that's important. I would say there's an estimated demand of about 66 units yeah. So middle income, so I index income to the HUD median income. So they publish every year a median family income. It's done by household size. So middle income is about 80% of the median up to 120%. So it's going to be in the range, like for a family of 4, it's going to be in the range of 60,000 all the way up to like 110. But for a family of 1, it's only going to be, 35,000 to 50,000. It's going to be much smaller. Yeah. It's kind of affordable housing speak. So that's why I stayed away from using the HUD definition, but yes. Yeah. That's just, it's that kind of range, but there's an actual chart. They publish a chart every year. So it's something that's easy to track because you can just go online and download the information. So if there was an incentive or a program targeted to people at certain income level, you just go to the chart. So you don't have to do any magical calculations. So, yeah. So I'm estimating kind of in that range, 66 units, starting at around 187.5, going up to 250 plus. Because, we're also talking about middle income being, people who can afford 300,000, perhaps even more than that in a home purchase. And then I think the other really important piece is alternatives for aging homeowners. Not every, person who's aging, and I'm going to tell you, I'm right there. So, I'm like, what am I going to do when I retire? What am I going to do with my big house that I raised my family in? It's a question I think that is facing a lot of people right now. And I don't know if any of you have looked at, well, geez, I'll just downsize. It's not an option. So, so kind of having those alternatives for aging homeowners who may say, you know what, I'm done taking care of this big house. I'd prefer to buy something smaller. Some may even prefer to rent. So kind of having those alternatives. What I said was, probably half of aging homeowners who are low and moderate income, I'll tell you right now, they're single women. The lower income, loss of a spouse can be devastating to their housing stability. But having an option for a place to go to rent or to buy that's more suited to their current situation. So I said about 50% of the low and moderate income, because those are probably the ones who are going to be struggling the most. And then I wouldn't go that high, maybe 20% of the middle and higher income aging homeowners, kind of, looking at options for them that are perhaps more expensive and maybe a little more varied. But so when I looked at that, I was kind of shocked at the number, but it came up at about 354 units of estimated demand. Now, mind you, I'm talking, over the next 10 years, not today. So, I think it's something to consider when you think about, what are we allowing to be built? What are we encouraging to be built? Who is it that we want to be home for, right? Who do we want? Who's going to call Clarkdale home 10 years from now? That's the way I look at it. So I guess I would like to hear from you. These were my thoughts, kind of going in, how do we solve this very challenging puzzle? And I'd like to hear from you who you might prioritize when you're thinking about, a type of household or a type of family. And it doesn't you don't have to, have a priority, but I'm just curious if, I've covered a lot of ground in the last few minutes, but I'm just curious, based on what you've heard, what you would consider a priority.
Question. Now, are you assuming a certain mortgage rate? The overall scheme of things, a grand plan.
So my back of the envelope is 2.8 times gross annual income. And it actually floats pretty well right now with interest rates. And it could be a little more. That could be 3 times income, maybe 3.5 times income if interest rates are really puny. But that 2.8 I've been in this business for 35 years and it holds pretty steady, ironically. Yeah.
2.8
Times 2.8 gross times gross household income. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I'll start with my thoughts. So, so a couple of things. One is part of what I would like, or I was hoping that we might see, is where has Clarkdale come? How have we gotten where we are? What has the growth pattern for housing been here? And it's kind of over time, what does it look like? So we have the historic town center. I'm going to call that pre-1950 kind of, almost. I'm making up decades here, but kind of by decade, because I've been here 20 years and the number of houses is almost doubled. Right. And one of the things we hear from people who are critical of us around housing is that we don't build enough houses in Clarkdale. Right. I don't know if anybody builds enough houses, but I would actually like to know what we actually have built. So what did Clarkdale look like in 1954 and how many houses were here and how has it progressed and how has it changed over time?
Mm-hmm.
I just think that would be great to see on a map. Like, it could be, Mountain Gate was built between 2005 and 2025. The Foothills was built, I don't know when, between 1975 and 1985, just to get a sense of how we actually as a community have grown, because I think that's also hard for people to see. In some ways, people live in neighborhoods. I think often when people from outside of Clarkdale think about Clarkdale, they think about the historic district. They don't think about the bigger picture of town. And so I think that would just be an interesting just perspective for us all to have a sense of that.
So, yeah, I can definitely do a decade by decade.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the
know.
right measure.
Yeah, yeah, there's certainly a decade by decade. It's gonna miss some stuff because the assessor's records are incomplete, and that's kind of because of the town size, what we rely on is their records.
Yeah.
But there is some discussion in there about like before this day, and before this date, we were 70% single family, and now we're much more than that. But I think we can do that and maybe get it mapped out too, I guess.
The second thought I have is, how do you stay ahead of the market? Because, for example, this is it's an impossible question. I understand you will not have an answer for this, but it's a philosophical question, I guess, for me is, how do you stay ahead of the market? Because Mountain Gate, I think, is a pretty good example of that. When Mountain Gate homes were built, they were market value. The market has changed dramatically in 20 years. But when you look at Mountain Gate and a 2-bedroom, 1,400 square foot townhouse is on the market for $369,000, when 15 years ago that was a $149,000 house. It's, I get that we need to build more houses, but unless we control how those are being built and who's building them and how they are subsidized, there is no guarantee that anything that we do does anything but bring in more market rate housing. And then we're back at the mercy of the market. And, and what could be a great house for somebody like you or I to downsize into is almost unaffordable.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So it's this weird market driving factors that I don't know. You do not have an answer for that. That's okay.
Now, if I did, I'd be on a tropical island
Yeah.
somewhere.
Knew the answer to that, right?
Well,
So, and I just have a couple more points and I'll be quiet. So the question for me is, I wrote private versus public/subsidized, right? So if you have public housing or subsidized housing, there is a greater ability to control who lives there and what people's incomes are and that kind of stuff. Because if you're just private builders, you have no control over that. So I just think that that's an important part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
That's right. The other thing that we've talked about just in kind of discussion is developing a vocabulary for us as a community to use. So like, what is our Clarkdale's definition of affordable housing? And it may track to other things. I get it.
Mhm.
What is our definition of middle income housing? What's our definition of workforce housing, which I know is a term some people don't use or it's not used or whatever. What is the definition of mixed use housing? Partly because part of the frustration I think that I've seen from the public and I'll use what's that called over there?
the
The plateau development, which is going to go right over there. Is those developers, when they came in and talked, they said, "Oh, we're building, housing for the workers." We're building, and the term workforce housing get thrown out, or maybe whichever one. But it wasn't really workforce housing; it was market rate housing. And so, for us to say to a developer, if you're going to use the term workforce housing, this is what it means to us as a community, because then we are all speaking the same language when we're talking about these issues. So I don't know if there's an opportunity in here to put some kind of a, vocabulary charter. It probably has a better name. And I'll stop there.
I think in at least one of the areas that Laura has talked about is how did we get here? And this is maybe more of my anecdotal comments on this because, and Carrie would know probably as well as I do, is that up until the recession, the kind of developments we were seeing here were just single housing developments. We didn't see, and we weren't promoting it because of how our land use is set out or whatever, and that's what we were seeing. Then the recession hit and everything stopped. So that was 2008. So we're now almost 20 years later. And when it started coming back, what was already on the books, which were not just Mountain Gate, but the Crossroads area. There was a development up in the foothills, Sienna Canyon, I think, Canyon. And they were all single family houses that were in some state of being held by the bank. They were in receivership or they'd gone bankrupt. So developers were picking them up and they were already established planned communities. So it wasn't like they could come back and change without having to start all over again. And so we've just been working on that. We've seen very little thought given to any areas that would be anything other than single family housing. So that's like the last since 2008. So that's anecdotal. I mean, I think we can quantify that. We can just look and see what developments didn't come through or stuff like that. I think the Plateau has been about the first family kind of development that we saw, and that what came in 2021, 22.
Right, and that was the first one since 1985.
Yeah.
Well, and that was kind of, 22 was kind of the push on the multifamily market. So I'm not surprised that that's, when that came in.
Yeah.
So,
And so the other part I was going to say, Laura and I had this weird discussion about 6 months ago about the subdivisions in Clarkdale when they came in. So I actually did go to the county. Okay. I had nothing better to do.
Obviously.
And downloaded a bunch of them. And it is interesting to see when they were platted. I mean, it's really very interesting to see when they were platted. And you don't see a lot after about 1995.
Right.
You have a few, but they were very small, except for Mountain Gate and Crossroads. So anyhow, I did download them just for my own look, and it is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that, that experience of, having a lot of things platted, entitled, ready to go when the market was, racing, between after, in the 2000s, is a kind of a universal experience of most Arizona jurisdictions because, it's a migration oriented state, right? We're all about growth. And so, there are places that everything is actually already entitled. So their ability to even do anything going forward is going to require reworking things. Highly unlikely just because of the cost. Yeah. So you're actually kind of fortunate that everything is not entitled. Yeah.
Are we going to talk about the zoning for areas? Like, this area, this would be ideal for multi-family homes and not single family. Are we going to have that discussion?
Yes. We'll be starting that. That's part of my zoning update, but we're gonna start talking about zoning districts very soon. And that's how we determine what gets built where. So we have established zoning districts, and it's the issue that we face, and I don't want to get too far off track here, is trying to get properties rezoned. That's the issue. And it's not just us, it's everywhere. So trying to get to some of the housing that is more affordable can be really difficult, but we'll talk about that in the zoning thing.
I'm just curious. So you had said in your presentation, 75% are owner occupied within Clarkdale.
Mhm.
How do you derive or get to that statistic? Because I'll be honest, I work in utilities and it certainly feels like way more than that.
So there's.
Revolving door in my office.
So there's two sources. One is the census. And then I also cross-check that with the assessor's data, which is primary data. And I go back to those use codes that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it may very well feel that way just because that's who you see.
Right, that's the
Right.
people I see every year go out and back in. But that's why I was curious where it comes from to validate, what the feeling is in the office rather than, what the numbers really say.
Mhm. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes.
But I'm really curious about how to create homes for low-income people. Subsidizing could be one way to do it, but part of what I've seen in the past is that homes will be built, low-income families will get in there, everything is what we're trying to achieve. And then a number of years go by, and then they could just sell the house at market price. And then that house can't be reused as a low-income house to live in. How do we deal with that?
There's multiple mechanisms to secure the underlying land use. So one is a straight up a land use restriction agreement or a deed restriction that says, upon resale, it has to be sold to somebody within this income range. And with hopefully there's equity there to share and those sorts of things. And the other is through what's called a community land trust, which is, or municipal land leases. If you say the municipality owns land, they could do a long-term leasehold on that land and through the leasehold agreement, restrict the use of the property. So the maximum time you can restrict the use of a property is 99 years, but you can renew that. So, and that's constitutional. So,
Okay.
but that's how it's done.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sorry, can you say again? So the alternatives for aging homeowners is going to be things like apartments that cluster type developments, where you have a sense of community, pocket neighborhoods. Like if you've looked at, if you look at creative solutions. So it's where people are, you're closer together. Density is probably a necessity when you start talking about affordability. You're not going to get an affordable unit probably on a 3-acre parcel, right? So probably not. You might, depending upon the land and the utilities and all of that. But so it's really looking at, can we build apartments? Can we build patio homes? Can we build housing that is lower maintenance? That somebody who is aging and is done taking care of a property, a large property, would find appealing. It could be. And, so when we look at population projections, and I think we've all heard the doom and gloom about, low birth rates and, the aging population and all of that. The fastest growing population is population age 85 and over going forward. So if you stop and think about that, you know, the large number of people who are going to be essentially in a position where independent living is a challenge, assisted living is probably in that, is kind of in that range of alternatives that might be considered. Yeah.
And we have a patio home area, which was part of Crossroads. And if you go look at that area, it is small lot, single family construction. So, and when it was built, it sold out quickly.
Hi, this is Ray Sallin. I'd just like to make a quick comment, if I could. And being in the real estate business, and my family's been in it as long as I've been alive. We've been in this very area since 1900, and overall, we feel the growth's been kind of moderate to low. When Del Webb came in to build the Cottonwood Ranch, they wouldn't repeat because the market wasn't tenacious. It took a long time to sell out. If you look at the other subdivisions, it takes a while. Clark doesn't have that great demand as, for example, a Flagler or a Prescott or Prescott Valley. The big problem that I see in affordability is that, I don't know what the margins are on home building, but nobody talks about builder margins, and I don't know what they are, but um, you know, that affects affordability. And so if people want to have an affordable home, how do you get a contractor to build within a range that he or she can make some funds? But a lot of the smaller builders, they're looking at much larger margins, not 20 or 30,000. They're looking at larger margins, and that of course makes the home more affordable, more unaffordable. If you're looking to be a developer like Mr. Lash is across the street from Town Hall, they had a very difficult time finding any lender that wanted to loan on a project that small. Now, to us in Clarkdale, we may think 56 units a big project. To a major lender, it's kind of an irritant. It's not big enough for those guys. $17 million project is not a big project. So John had to finally work out a deal that I think they're going to fund it internally to make the project work. So there's financing problems, there's home cost problems, there's cost to build. There's a lot of issues. And my great example for inflation, I've been a Diamondback ticket holder since day one. We first started parking our car down there to a game, it was $8. Now the same lot's $30. I go, wow, that's how unaffordable for a family to go to a baseball game, $30, and you got to buy the tickets, the food, the prizes. That's a $200 outing for a family, which is kind of unaffordable now. So it appears that this inflation's really hit us all, whether it's going to a baseball game or buying a home. And I know I'm like a broken record, but I just think there's a lot of greed in the market. And until that comes out, we're not going to have affordability. I mean, people raise their rents just to raise their rents because they have the opportunity to, but do they really need to do that margin wise? I don't know. So there's a lot of problems, and I'm in the business, and I realize that I'm speaking against my own business, but I think that it'd be good to have a group of builders explain why it costs so much to build a house. And honestly, what are the margins? Because it's not affordable. And how many people around have $80,000 to $100,000 put down on a $450,000 home to get under the 20% range? It's difficult, very, very difficult in this area. So, we can expand the densities, make things dense and smaller. But basically we're seeing the quality of living going down just because the costs are so high. And we've looked at a lot of ways to do it. It's difficult, and I don't mean to be negative, but there's no simple solution. And if things can be subsidized, it's wonderful. There was a program that we used forever in real estate here through the Farm and Home Administration that they did cap what a seller could sell their home for. They did limit the profit, and then the money went back to Farm and Home so they can make other loans. So I don't know if those programs are still in existence, but they did work for years.
So yeah, Yavapai County is no longer eligible for those programs because of the
Okay.
urbanization. So at least over here as much as on the other side of the hill too. So, so my experience with the incentive side of things is you have to layer the incentives. And if you can layer enough incentives, and there's a buck to be made, it'll happen. It does go back to, is there a buck to be made? We don't want our builders to be, having to move into our low income housing either. So, it's like where, we have to have kind of that line. When development is subsidized at like the state or the federal level, they will cap builder profit. They will cap developer fees. So there are mechanisms to do that, but there's a level of sophistication required to do that, that I wouldn't attempt to lay on, the town of Clarkdale, because it is a fairly sophisticated lending environment. And my background is in development finance. So, it's complicated. We've got capital, you read about capital stacks and all those other things that developers are dealing with. So, I think that it is possible. I think you just have to be very clear on the front end. This, what, we are looking for this in our community. We're willing to offer these kinds of incentives. And, what can you do? And I would say 9 times out of 10, when the community is proactive, somebody comes to the table with something that's workable. So that's that proactive, but you got to say, this is, this is what's important to us as a community. So they know, because otherwise they're just, shooting in the dark at what you might want or need. Yeah.
Ray, maybe you know something about this, or Mary, maybe you do. Robin, you might. The new development that's going in Camp Verde. How is that being financed? Because that is affordable housing. Is it?
Mary could do it.
Whoever can do it. I'm just,
Yes.
because I
Yes.
think it's.
And maybe talk about
maybe we can
LIHTC.
talk about LIHTC and use that as an example, because
Yeah.
because I think that's one of our neighbors, a very close neighbor who is putting in a pretty substantial affordable housing.
Yeah. So it's low income housing tax credit. It has other layers of financing in it, some state money, some other federal money. Probably God knows, what else is in there. I think there's some social services resources in there, because that's a very unique development in a lot of ways. It's very community sensitive. I was actually kind of impressed, more impressed than often with a tax credit project. So that's that project. It used to be in the Verde Valley that there.
How many units? I'm curious.
350,
Yeah.
so it's big. It's bond, that's a combination of, so there's bond financing available through the state, and they couple that with tax credits, non-competitive tax credits. It's a fairly complicated system. It's a specialized kind of development. Very.
Can you talk about typically how long a LIHTC project takes from inception to through financing and all of those kinds of things?
So from the day that the dream is born, the conception, as you say, from the day of conception to unit delivery, on the short end of the time scale is probably about 2.5 years. And then on the long end, it's just, whatever processes are slowing it down. So, and 2.5 years is for like your more standard, 60, most tax credit projects are in the 50 to 60 unit range. So, that's that 2.5 years when they're pretty standard like that. But like a big project, I can imagine that Atlantic probably worked on that for 6 or 7 years before it even came out as something that was viable. It's not unlike any other kind of development.
Right.
It's many, many, many years of work before you see sticks and bricks. It's a long time coming.
I think if you,
We've been
just
waiting
for
that
information,
for how many years?
yeah,
I mean, I don't think we should let sort of like, this could take a long time to achieve, be a deal breaker for that, because how long have we been waiting for that to come in?
2 years at
mean,
least.
Right? We've been
Yeah.
waiting 3 years, at least,
Two-
2 to
2
3
years,
years.
I believe.
think.
But I think it would be interesting for us to know, in terms of, as we look at what is doable possibly, is what did Sycamore Vista, how did that deal come together? Because Mary's right, it's a little bit of LIHTC funding, it's private capital is in it, and the other services they brought in around it to make it happen. But I think the timeline, it would be interesting to know the timeline on that in terms of when it came to the town and when it got approved and broke ground.
Yeah, you can ask them.
Is there a national developer with billions of dollars in life development? You know, they're unique in the industry, in the country. And so that has also been their advantage. They're actually financing it themselves. They never go outside for external financing except for the bonding that they can get and the LIHTC funding. Otherwise, they've got those switches themselves. So that makes a big difference.
But I think that's an important kind of information to know if we're going to look at areas that we might want to do, maybe not something that big, but in, some a tight clustered community that might have some affordable type of financing into it, or and as well as market rate in it. And do we provide services? Do we bring services to it like childcare or whatever? Because that one has, I believe, a childcare component to it, Head
It
Start.
does, it's getting.
Yeah, and that's more and more standard. So there's a lot of, there's most of the big tax credit development companies are in fact national. They're national companies. They hold property. They have huge portfolios all across the country. That's that kind of specialty thing. But there are still small tax credit developers and charitable tax credit developers, nonprofit developers who are often, those are usually the ones who are willing to do the smaller or more unique types of projects.
And that to me sort of circles back to my initial question, which was how do we stay ahead of the market? Is that if we really want to build affordable housing here, then as a community, do we have to identify a place and a size, and just, you had a number of how many units we'd need. And I don't think we could say, as a community, we're going to build 350 units of whatever. I mean, we're small. But if we set a goal to say, we'd like to build between 50 and 75 units, and how do we get to, what is the name of the no, but the developer, you said. the name,
Atlantic.
Atlantic, right. How do we engage with somebody like that to say, like, we want to talk to you because we recognize in our town, we also need, I mean, I think those 350 units in Camp Verde are going to go incredibly far to addressing, a part of the issue in our community, but it's certainly not going to address it all. And it's 35 miles away, so, so to me, like that feels like a nugget of how do we potentially stay, away from what we think and what people, I think, genuinely think are trying to build housing for the community that quickly is driven by a market that is bringing people, like all the things that drive up market rate housing,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways to approach that, and I can certainly connect you, with different methods of reaching different kinds of developers. And,
There are cities and towns, and they're always interesting and whatnot, but.
There's also an annual affordable housing conference, and so it's primarily low-income housing tax credit developers, but it's a good way to, just kind of get yourself out there and meet people. And then I suggest you call me and ask after you're done.
I don't want to
No.
talk anymore because I think, both Laura and I
Sorry.
are kind of in this a lot. So I'd like to hear from all of you who are on this committee with me is, what do you see? What does this tell you?
I'd like to, I guess for me, I'd like to, if we're building a certain price range, I'd like to know what's not possible. Like if it's with the land and the way the building is now, you're just not going to build a single family home on whatever for that certain price. I'd like to know right now, well, we got to go down this road. That would be helpful for me. And then, and right now, this is the worst case scenario, man. We have high mortgage rates. We have the median price in the whole country is 400 and some $1,000. So are we planning for this continuing? Are we planning for some pricing to stabilize, whatever? And then it'd be interesting. And there's a lot of towns in the same boat as we are. And who has figured it out? Has anybody figured it out? If it's not figured out, then,
Yeah, I think I mentioned I've been in this business for 35 years. And there's never been a shortage of need in that time. I will tell you, you have touched on something that's vitally important though, and that is that should we experience a market downturn, that is the best time to do something. And so what I encounter, because I go, I'm all over the place talking to various governing bodies as well, it's not an issue anymore. And I'm like, it is absolutely is an issue. And now's the time to do it. So, just always kind of keep that in the back of your mind that, you want to buy when the market is low, right? You always want to buy when the market's low. You want to build when the market's low so that there's opportunities for growth.
I remember when I built or bought our first home in Southern California, I didn't have money for a down payment. So I rated our 401k plan, got the money, and they said, oh, don't do that, do that. But that worked out great for us. And I basically borrowed from myself, paid it back.
Yeah.
So otherwise, I would have never bought a home and would have missed out.
Yeah.
But I think we kind of answered the question is we need to plan now, irregardless
Yep.
of what the market is doing, because then we're prepared.
And you have to be realistic about your economy. I live in Yavapai County. I've lived in Yavapai County for several decades, and the economy is not great. There's not a lot of economic opportunity for families. People are working on that, and it's a constant effort. But it's hard to compete when you're that close to Maricopa County, and the jobs that, and the resources that are there. So when you think about being realistic about the local economy and the jobs that are available and the jobs that have historically been available, that kind of helps you to index that to say, you know what, we want to be sure that we can sustain the businesses that we have and the economic development that we have been successful with. Yes.
Is there any benefit instead of building one large project, but to split it into a couple projects? Because that way you can maybe get in and out of a smaller project quicker, and then you have another one on the way and another. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes and no. So small projects are complicated because of the financing. Ray mentioned that, access to financing, people getting their crews lined up to, actually do the construction once you're in the ground. So it is a little more challenging, and it oftentimes is more expensive. So you almost have to find a kind of a niche builder or developer who wants to work with you, or somebody local, who, is already actively building in the region who says, oh, you know what, I can step it up from the duplex to, 12 units or something along those lines.
Right. Well, I was thinking more like maybe you have 30 units in one project and then another 30, 40 in another, but
Yeah, when you start to talk to multifamily developers, they'll tell you exactly what their bottom number of units is. Yeah, they'll just straight up say, I can't develop anything smaller than whatever, and it's going to vary by location. It's not the same everywhere. Yeah.
And honestly, that's been part of the delay with Plateau, is trying to find a crew that can build it. Because it is such a small project. A lot of the big production builders, it's too small for them. And it's too big for some of the guys around here that do all of the custom homes.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of a,
That and financing.
yeah.
Also, so the two that we've talked about, those are the holdups.
I have a question and building, do the people that build homes, the big guys, small guys, are they all paying roughly the same price for 2x4s and building materials, or is a quite big range?
No, bulk purchase will always get you a better price. So,
Is that a night and day difference, or?
It can, yeah, like between like a, single family custom home, that guy's going to Home Depot or Lowe's, or, maybe there's a lumber company where, they're getting their lumber from, but they can't direct order from, one of the mills or something like that, like a big developer would. So, yeah, they have the middleman. And Selena, you were starting to say something earlier and then you were interrupted, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't lose, you may have lost the thought by now, but if you haven't, I'd love to hear you.
Yeah, on your slide, you mentioned, you were asking that question, who do we prioritize?
Yeah.
From what you're saying is that not necessarily what the low or middle income person needs, there's an overlap with the aging population as well. So it's not saying that one should be, this is a house for a family and not an older person, or vice versa. Okay.
Yeah. And developers will do their own market study. They'll look at this needs analysis, and they'll have already kind of have a picture of, what the population here is like. But they will do an independent market analysis. So they may come back and say something, slightly different, but no lender is going to, well, I shouldn't say no lender. Some lenders will lend without an independent market analysis, but most will not. So.
But in a community that is small, that isn't necessarily being done if you're just having a development of 10, maybe 15 units. They aren't necessarily doing a market analysis. How does the community help that? Or do we?
Well, I think, this assessment, I think, paints a picture of kind of, and there's a historical perspective to that as well. So it kind of paints a picture of what's occurred, and they'll look at other projects, and there's nothing like primary data. There's nothing like calling up, property managers and saying, how long's your waiting list? What kinds of issues are you having? You can ask, builders will tell you, this is what I'm experiencing and trying to sell, or trying to keep a crew, or any of those things. So they talk among, if they're smart, they're talking amongst themselves. So,
How did Camp Verde get this Sycamore going? How did that happen?
I can't answer that.
The thing is, it was a huge project. They went out and they recruited a developer for it. So it was a mutual arrangement. But the big deal is Kimberly's Bell Park. There's none of the other communities do.
Yeah. But it's more than property, is it not? It's also their priority.
It's their priority. And very honestly, for a number of years, they've had a real commitment to doing development. So their zoning and the work they've done in community development has put these kind of projects as a priority. And to be perfectly honest, not made it help for a developer coming in with those kinds of things. So they went out of their way to partner with Atlantic Development to get them there.
Okay, for the record, could Mary please identify herself, please, up at the microphone?
Sorry, I'm Mary Chiquin. I'm the Executive Director of the Verde Valley Community Development Organization, the one that has the Verde Valley Housing Alliance and is working on a whole lot of levels of housing here across the region. Implementing a community land trust, doing a regional marketing campaign to educate about the issues of housing. We've done, we're working on the cost to build a house study. You may have heard about the developable land database that I know Gus did all the work for that. We just went live in Yavapai County. So on the county website, there's a secondary layer now of developable land in the Verde Valley. So we're doing those kinds of projects on a regional level.
Thanks.
Okay, so I know I had a couple more questions for you. I just can't remember what they are and they're on the slides. And then you might have some more questions for me as well, but this conversation, I think is really, it's helpful to me because it helps me to understand kind of, where you guys are headed with your thought process. And I hope that it's equally helpful to you. So kind of when we talk about preserving neighborhoods, there's a couple pieces to that. One is, doing the regular neighborhood cleanups. Clarkdale's been good about that. I did the little patio park revitalization strategy a while back. And I love that little neighborhood and I go down there, and I'm like, man, it's, it looks so much better than it did 2 years ago. And I think there's some real opportunity there, but I think it's also really important to preserve the history and the affordability and the longevity of the family property transfers that have occurred in that neighborhood and in other neighborhoods. And some of the other Centerville being the other one, I think that has a particular historical character to it that's definitely worth preserving. And then I think there's, the thing that, and I think the kids caught this in their posters. I don't know if you noticed that in their posters, is this walkability and connectivity that, you have that. And maintaining that is really, I think when I come to Clarkdale, that's the charm for me. I'm like, oh man, you can walk almost anywhere. And then I think that's really, really important to kind of preserve that character and think about, how you go about doing that. And you do that, of course, through design and other mechanisms. And then there's also overlay districts, the downtown district, and really looking at the form of buildings over the density of buildings or the zoning of buildings so that you have that character. So you're not, you don't have a modern ranch next to a, historic building. You want, some graduation. So I think that looking as much as you can when you're doing code revisions at, how do we look at form and function and not just underlying zoning, I think is really important in a community of this size. So. And I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on like how to go about preserving neighborhoods, how, that may be something that you're looking at, working on, but that's where I go when I think about preservation and revitalization is don't lose the charm when you do it. Okay, I think I just had one more, and then we have the Neighbors We Need outreach campaign that the working group is going to be putting together. So there'll be some volunteers. They're not here today, but we'll be asking, they'll be volunteering to kind of do some voiceover stuff and some other things with that. And then I want to remind you that not everyone is visibly low income. And I think this is an important thing to communicate in a community, especially of people who, are fairly comfortable in their ways. And that's, probably every third neighbor is somebody who's actually struggling, but you don't know it. And I think that that is something that's really important to kind of keep front and center, is that, we need to take care of each other. And that's part of making sure that there's options for people who might not be able to sustain where they're living. So, if you have other thoughts on raising awareness, and we talked about definitions and like having a common vocabulary as being important.
One of the other things that I think of Clarkdale is as a naturally occurring retirement community. My whole neighborhood, our neighborhood, is primarily single people who are over the age of 55, up to my next door neighbor's 88, and we're in the historic district, and we all have these little houses, that are between 900 and 1,400 square feet, like, on little lots. And it is one of the things, we are aging in place here. And I suspect that most of us in that little corner of town will be doing that. Because I think about, as we go down the street, I think about who's there, and it's mostly maybe two people in our houses. And most of us are getting to retirement if we haven't already retired, and we'll be needing different kinds of services. And, and I come from a community where, these were high rises that became naturally occurring retirement communities because people just were aging in place. And all of a sudden you had a building that was filled with, people between the ages of 65 and 85,
Yep.
And what does that mean for us as a community? And our statistics that you presented to us very much show that we are a community that is aging, and that people who are coming here to age in place. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Some of us.
So, well, it seems, according to the numbers, most of us seem to be in that range.
Yeah, and that is exactly it, I
Yeah,
didn't
no,
do
that's
projections, but
true.
that
18
is,
and-
you also have a lot of pre-retirement,
Right.
like like you're saying about your neighborhood, right? That kind of 55 and over,
Celine is the youngster.
and the youngster, right? But yeah, so, and this is also in the assessment, but I think it's really important to consider that as we age, we need more help with things. And we need those people to not be 35 miles away when we call, because there's people 35 miles away who need their services too.
Yep.
And that's really an important thing, I think, in our communication, is that the people in landscapers, housekeepers, cooks, certainly medical staff, that's an automatic, but the people who we rely on to help us through our daily lives, we want them close by. And that's, I think, where you have to really start to think, there's both sides, right? How do we maintain that balance? I don't know.
Yeah. No, I joke with my neighbors that we all should just pool our money and hire a handy person and a nurse.
And move them into the
Take care
ADU.
of, the group of us.
Yep, well, and now with the ADU stuff coming up, you just pull the ADU and the handyman lives over there and, I don't know, right? So, yeah, but it's certainly a fact of where we are, as a community, and actually kind of as a nation. So, but you're going to be competing for those people who provide those services. So you've got to have something.
They need a place to live.
Absolutely. They got to have a place to live, and it's got, there's got to be something other than work for them to do. So,
When you say raise awareness, you mean like educate the public, right? I think we should also include something about high density housing actually uses less water per capita. That's very important
Right.
fact. When you have these planned developments, you have these kind of restrictions on the HOA, you know, that all benefits to our limited water resources. The draw of the Verde River, the draw of the recreational aspects of this area that it provides. High density housing in the right place, connected to city infrastructure, town infrastructure, actually uses less, has low water needs per capita than a single family home.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's very important, especially here.
Yes. Yeah, I think it is. The kind of marrying the need for housing with we have this dual benefit.
You know, this is a nationwide issue. We don't have enough housing in general. The way other people live in other countries are more dense, smaller. We didn't go that route in the United States. So we should really think about the future. What does that mean? Maybe it means higher density. We can't be living in single family homes like I do. We should be maybe adjusting that.
Mhm. And I think that is that kind of breadth of options that we talk about. And it's hard, we're kind of programmed culturally to want a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a fenced yard and a garage and, 2 kids and a dog and a cat and, and a couple horses maybe, right? So, that it's kind of, it's our culture that's our dream, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that there are people who see it differently. So, and you don't have to attract everybody. So,
Though, from a buyer
Part of the
standpoint,
campaign. Oh,
Ray's talking.
Go ahead, Ray.
When we developed Mingus Shadows in 1982, we felt that we had done a wonderful job, and then we found out we didn't because we made the lots too big. And most of the folks there that moved in there didn't want a lot 140 feet deep by 100 feet, and we thought that extra space would make them feel nice and cozy. And a lot of them are retirees, and they wanted a much smaller lot, less maintenance, less landscaping. So the way that I thought the people came here for the larger lots, etc., wasn't true. And that wasn't true in 1982. I think today even more so. When I talk to younger people that are looking to buy something, they're looking, they're looking for a lot of density on their lot because they want to be able to afford it. And what I would love to see this committee have is the 18 to 35-year-old group come in and tell us what they're looking for, because guys my age aren't going to build this community anymore. I mean, I'm 68 years old. I'm one of those aging in place guys. I don't work as hard as I used to work. I'm thinking more about healthcare and what downsizing maybe, but I just really wanted what the young folks are looking for, because I'm not young anymore, and I don't want to pretend that I know what's in their minds. And so I'd love to hear their opinions of what they're looking for. And most of my developer friends they don't live here. They live in other communities, and they're small lots, and people seem to accept it and they like it. That's not what I like, but there again, I'm blessed to live on 6 acres. I'm spoiled. When I lived in Jerome, Arizona, we had neighbor to neighbor growing up as a kid. I actually enjoyed it, but when I came to Clarkdale, there was nobody out where I live, and so we live on 6 acres. But from a security standpoint, for an old guy, I'd rather have a neighbor much closer personally. So your mind changes, and whether the 68-year-old or the 55-year-old or the 35-year-old, I think we all think a little different. But I think that the affordability factor, I keep thinking about my kids, my daughters, and I watch what they go through, and they have decent jobs, they do okay, but it's a struggle. And I'd like to figure out some magical solution, but I don't know what that is. Carrie's got a younger daughter. She probably knows what I'm talking about. We think about our kids and what's going to make them happy, and that's really what's more in my mind is how are my kids going to do well. I'm almost 70 years old, you know, I'm more worried about them.
I think, well, Ray, I agree with you absolutely. We have to make sure we're talking to the right audiences too, and finding out where, you know, how they look at the world today very differently than us. But back to that education campaign in terms of denser housing does not mean more higher use of water. I think
Mhm.
that's a really big message that that has to be woven into here. Um, because it's true. You have better infrastructure, you have less, and with the way houses or any, whether it's single or multifamily, the way they're built today with the energy efficiency and water efficiency systems in them. And we can actually probably track that with some of the areas. I know Virginia does a lot of that kind of work, so we can see what happens in the new, particularly in the newer developments. Even if they are single family, they probably use less water than, let's say, somebody in Centerville or somebody in even downtown. You know, I'd like to see some of those comparisons because that starts making the case of why smaller housing closer together does not impact our water.
Well, and it matches the types of households that Yavapai County has historically attracted. So, you know, it is a kind of a retirement place. So, yep.
It doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't have to be. And then we have to think about families because they, of course, we need them, right? We're going to need them as we go forward. I think I had one more slide to share. And then I'm like, wow, I'm like right on time. So, yeah, the developing and maintaining partnerships, there's a lot on this slide. I think I've gone over most of it in our conversation. Simple solutions. The private sector is going to need some kind of incentives. I've already drafted something and just wanted to kind of get this kind of, you know, on your radar. And at some point those incentives will come forward as well. So, you know, private sector needs to make a profit. The nonprofit sector needs to make a profit because they're not going to survive without being profitable. And I want to point out, you know, I know you guys are code focused, but not all solutions are development solutions. You know, we have to kind of take a step back, and the financing came up. But there's other ways to kind of, you know, attack the issue. And, you know, you have solid regional employers. You've got some good, you know, solid local businesses. Those businesses may be a source of financing or financial backing for projects that serve the people who work for them, because it's an issue for our employers to attract and retain employees, and the employees themselves are saying, hey, you know what, it's an issue. It's definitely an issue for us. So, you know, I think while you guys are focused on code, you know, I'm also looking at these kind of bigger kind of ideas around, you know, how do we partner with the private sector, with our employers, with the nonprofit sector, in order to kind of come at the issue from multiple directions. So, you know, from my perspective, keep doing your good work. And, you know, we'll come back and have another conversation. We've got one scheduled in September with the working group, or October, I guess it is. And then we'll do something in January as well to kind of wrap things up before we come to council. Yeah. I don't know if you have any other questions or things that ideas you'd like to share.
I just, one thought is, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal that younger, you know, people 25 to 40 seem to like amenities and, you know, to be together and like pools and workout rooms and things like that. And places, you know, where they can mingle and especially if they're single. So whatever that, an enclave like that would be pretty cool, I think.
Something that's, amenity rich, I think
Yeah.
is definitely important. You do have, you know, the outdoor recreation, kind of, you know, on your doorstep. And that's also a big draw, for, well, people of all ages, but certainly for, you know, the more rugged crowd. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, so anything else on this one?
Okay.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And, yeah.
So we'll go on to part B, zoning code update.
So I did just want to talk briefly about next steps, as Selena had asked about when are we going to start working on districts. Very soon in August, we're going to start looking at some of these zoning districts and talk about um, how we could address some of these issues with the zoning code and kind of so that it is, the focus is, we make a bigger allowance for different forms of housing. Right now, our zoning code focuses on single-family residential, and that's what we're getting. But the ability to expand some of that to some more modular homes, because we're limited and where those can go right now. In fact, we're pretty much built out of mobile home area. We can't, there's no place to put them. So looking at something like that is where can we expand those things? And then also looking at broadening the ability to use multifamily housing and like the middle housing, the duplex, the triplex, the quadplex, fitting those into projects, into neighborhoods. You know, growing up in the Midwest, in some of the larger cities, it was not at all unusual to walk down the street and see single family, a duplex, you'd have 2 flats and then another single family, then another 2 flat, so that these are mixed right in with the rest of the development. We don't have just this section over here and this is where the duplexes go. And that's really how our zoning code is written. So this is going to be a heavy lift. I appreciate all of you volunteering to do this. I'm open to suggestions to, you know, by all means, you know, start taking a look at that. We're going to have some draft suggestions out here in the next couple of weeks for the August meeting so that we can really tackle this. You can see how complex a problem it is and how many different things there are that feed into this housing issue. And it's like Martina, I've been doing this for 30 odd years and I have never seen occupancy rates like this before. Never, ever, 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 ever. And so to have vacancy rates at less than 5%, it basically means they're just turning over from sale to sale or rental to rental. So we don't really have any vacancies. So those are the kinds of things that we're hoping that we can start looking at in the zoning code and start broadening what's available in which zoning districts so that these options can be part of the solution. Any questions?
No, but I like to have Alan ask if it's okay for me to ask that we have our August meeting changed because at least 2 of us aren't here. We're out of town at the League of Cities and Towns Conference.
Yes, we can.
And
It would be the 21st, the third Thursday.
so it's the 20th, so it has to be something else.
Yeah,
besides the
'cause we're-
21st. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we'll double check and make sure that this room is available or we can find some place. But I think the Wednesday or the Thursday before would be an ideal date. And I hate to keep changing the meetings like this, but there's,
About August? You're talking for August? Okay.
Okay.
Like August 14th, is that what we're if we would change to that.
Yeah, we have a meeting next week with Jessica, the zoning consultant. So, and Britt and I have been working on changes to the zoning code already, so we should be able to get something together and out to you hopefully with a little bit of advanced time to read rather than just the last minute. We'll probably send out an early draft and then a refined draft so that you can at least see where we're thinking, and then right before the, closer to the meeting, something that's more refined so that we can narrow the focus a bit.
Anybody else for Ruth? Any questions? Okay. So go to item 5, future agenda items. Does anybody have anything to discuss on that, or they want to put on a future agenda? Okay, don't see anybody. So we'll take a request for adjournment.
And seconded.
Laura,
Laura. And Becky seconds.
you second?
Yes.
Yeah. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay,